You wake up from a nightmare, drenched in cold sweat. The details are hazy, but you remember being forced to study the Grunfeld defense for 10 hours every single day. In a desperate search for salvation, you check your phone and find this video. Relief washes over you. Welcome to the top 3 chess gambits. Today, you're going to learn the ins and outs of the best chess gambits. Number 3, Danish Gambit. The Danish Gambit is very popular and has a lot of attacking potential. We start off with e4, e5, and d4, the starting position of the Danish Gambit. We sacrifice the pawn on move 2. E takes d4, and at this point we could take the pawn and be completely fine, but we're here to have fun. So instead we play c3, sacrificing yet another pawn. D takes c3, and now of course we can take and be completely fine, right? Instead of that, we're going to push our limits and play bishop c4, because is it really a gambit if you're not sacrificing your entire queenside? C takes b2 and bishop takes b2. Black will usually play something like bishop b4 check, to which we can reply with knight c3. Knight f6 and now knight ge2. Both sides can castle. Keep in mind that this is an example line, and since the center is so open, the game can go a million different ways. Now knight c6, and only now can we play knight d5, which is a staple of the Danish Gambit. We generally play this move only after we see knight c6, as this ensures the knight cannot be kicked out by any pawns, specifically the c-pawn. If black takes the e4 pawn, you can play queen d3. This position is already plus 2.5 in your favor on the eval bar. Now, to demonstrate how quickly this game can fall apart for black, take a look at some of these lines. If your opponent drops the knight back to f6, capture it. Then follow up with queen g3 check, and then h4, aiming to take this f6 pawn. Black has no way of stopping this besides knight e5, to which we just play bishop d3. This looks like a blunder, but black cannot take the bishop, as then we will take on f6 and fork the king and queen. Bishop d3 also threatens mate. There are no good moves for black here, and the position is plus 6. If instead your opponent drops the knight back to d6, we can take the bishop on b4, and after black recaptures, slide the queen over to c3, hitting the knight and threatening checkmate simultaneously. If black attempts something like queen h4, we have g3 and then f3, and we win a piece no matter what. Now that we ruled out knight takes e4, your opponent could also try d6, which is not much better. Knight takes f6, d takes f6, knight g3, preparing knight h5 to attack the f6 pawn. The position is already plus 3. If, for example, bishop e6, we can still play knight h5 because our threat is so much greater than what black is threatening. If black takes on c4, for example, we have a force mate in 2 with queen g4. Going back to this position, black could also try knight takes d5, which is the best move, but the position is still very complicated, and after bishop takes d5, if your opponent plays the seemingly normal d6, we take the knight and then plant our queen on d4, turning above the bishop and checkmate. If your opponent slides back to bishop e7, which is the best move, we have the same approach as we saw earlier with knight g3 and knight h5. And the position is deemed equal by the engine, but it is very imbalanced, with white being down 2 pawns but having much better attacking chances. Finally, if we go back to the original position, black's best move here is d5, returning a pawn back but eliminating a lot of the counterplay for white. This is a big reason for why the Danish is 3rd on the list. Bishop takes d5, knight f6, and now we sacrifice the bishop on f7, seemingly win a queen. However, bishop b4 check happens, and now since the rook is attacking our queen, our best move is to bring the queen back to d2, trade it off, and end up in an equal position. There's still a lot of attacking opportunities here for white, but there are just as many for black. Most notably, both players will try to use the 2-pawn majority on each side of the board to their advantage. This covers the Danish Gambit. Overall, it gets a 7.8 out of 10 rating for me. Let's move on to number 2. Blackmar Diemer Gambit. This one's for all you d4 players. It's fairly popular and has a surprising amount of tactics for how simple the position looks. d5 and now e4, sacrificing a pawn. Black takes, knight c3, knight f6, and now we play f3, which is pretty much the starting position of the Blackmar Diemer Gambit. The point is, we give up a pawn for much better development and a ton of attacking chances, as we will see very soon. Black takes and we play knight f3. Black has multiple moves here, the most popular one being bishop g4. We play h3, and if black takes the knight, we get our queen to f3. Note that if bishop h5 was to occur, an aggressive g4 would be our move. Here, our queen is attacking the b7 pawn, so black is forced to do something about this. Black can very easily mess up here, as the natural knight c6 is actually completely losing after bishop d5, hitting the knight to the king and double attacking the knight. Black could try queen d7, but then d5. With plus 3 on the eval bar, black's best bet is to simply sacrifice a piece. Alternatively, in this position, black could try e6, and after bishop takes c6, b takes c6, and queen takes c6 check, black's idea is to play knight d7, blocking the check and still having the queen protect the rook. However, the position is still doomed, as white has bishop g5, f6, bishop f4, attacking the c7 pawn, and after rook c8, knight b5 ends up being the devastating blow, and the game is basically over, as the pawn is going to fall, and black will have to sacrifice material to avoid being checkmated. Back to this position. The best move for black instead of knight c6 is just to play c6. Here we play a move that would have gotten you kicked out of chess club had you played it in the 80s. g4. This hyper-aggressive, engine-esque move is actually very good and makes a lot of sense. Your kingside pawns are already exposed, given your lack of f-pawn, so because of this, in some situations, you will have to castle queenside. So why not just push the kingside pawns? e6 and now g5, evicting the knight and sending it to d5. Note here that we should only capture the knight if the enemy queen cannot recapture it back. If you played knight takes d5 right now, black would take back with the queen and your position would suck because the queen destroys most of your counterplay. We'll get a better example of this in a moment. Bishop d3 and black has two moves here, bishop e7 and knight takes c3. Let's look at bishop e7 first. Bishop e7 aims to take the g5 pawn, so naturally we play h4. Your opponent can do a bunch of things here. Let's take a look at a few candidate moves as well as our ideas. If your opponent castles, you're going to place your queen on e4 to try and checkmate your opponent. Depending on the response, you're likely going to continue to push this h-pawn in order to open up the position. This could look something like this, where taking the h-pawn gives us may in 1, and if bishop takes g5, we can play h takes g6. If the f-pawn captures back, you take on e6 with check, and you have potential checkmating opportunities if the king moves to either g7 or h8, because you can sacrifice the rook, which leads to checkmate. If h takes g6, then queen e5, threatening mate in 1. The best move here is bishop h4 check, but after king e2 and queen h2, black loses the bishop and ends up down a piece. Clearly, castling isn't very smart here, so your opponent could try knight d7. Remember what I said about capturing the knight on d5? Now's the time. Develop normally and castle queenside. If your opponent plays aggressively and brings the queen out, you need not worry because this pawn is poisoned. If black takes on d4, bishop c3 initiates the following sequence where you end up in a much better position with plus 2.5 on the eval bar. Now we enter the critical position, which is the primary reason this gambit is second place instead of first. Knight takes c3, b takes c3, bishop d6, and short castle. So why would we do a kingside castle if the king is so exposed? Because our queenside is also exposed. It makes more sense to castle kingside because the majority of our pieces are located here and black doesn't really have any pieces attacking us. Black castles and we continue with h4, knight d7, queen e4, threatening mate. Even though our position looks very strong, black has enough pieces to defend our attack if played right. Ideally, we would try to put our queen and maybe a rook on the h-file, see if we can force the opponent to crumble under pressure. But with accurate play, black will manage to equalize, which is why the Blackmar Diemer Gambit takes the second place and gets a rating of 8.4 out of 10. Now for our number 1 spot, the best gambit in the entire world, according to me, is the Diemer's Gambit. Incredibly strong, and there are so many tactics and resources that is still played even at the very top level of chess, which is very rare to see when it comes to gambits. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, and bishop c5. This is very normal stuff. Now, for the starting position of the Diemer's Gambit, we play b4, sacrificing a pawn to remove a piece from controlling the d4 square. Now the bishop takes, and now we can play c3, kicking it back and preparing d4. Note here that the bishop can go to either a5 or c5, with a5 being a little bit more popular, but if the knight takes instead, this transposes into the same position as the bishop going back to c5. d4, e takes d4, and now we castle. We don't need to recapture the pawn immediately, and black should definitely avoid taking the c3 pawn because it leads to a completely losing position. For example, takes, and now bishop takes f7, sacrificing the bishop for a pawn. King takes, and now we play queen d5 check, forking the king and bishop, winning back our piece, and achieving a much greater position because even though we are down 2 pawns, we will recapture the c3 pawn, and now black can no longer castle and is far behind in development. From this position, your plan would be to play rook e1 and start pushing this e-pawn to capitalize on your advantage in development. Back to this position, your opponent's best move is d6. Now we can actually take back on d4, bishop b6, and now I recommend h3, which is a prophylactic move. It's aimed at stopping bishop g4. Knight f6, knight c3, and now we reach our first major crossroads. We're going to cover 2 moves here, starting from castles. But it's important to know that black can realistically play maybe 5 or 6 different random moves here that actually make total sense. Now, castling is not a very good move because we can quickly launch an attack, starting with bishop g5. h6, bishop h4, and now with g5, we can sacrifice our knight, takes, bishop takes d4, and now knight d5, attacking the knight which cannot take because it is pinned to the queen. If your opponent takes the rook, we take back with the queen, and your opponent is in trouble. Knight takes f6 is coming and our attack is in full effect. This position is already +5. If bishop e6, we play a complicated move with bishop b5. The point is if bishop takes d5 and e takes d5, this knight is forced to move and we win the bishop. This is evaluated as around +3. Back to this position, of course, your opponent doesn't have to play a g5 and can just go back to knight e7. In this case, bishop takes f6, ruining black's pawn structure, and then just queen d2, aiming at h6. Going back to the crossroads, black could try bishop d7. Now we can play e5. Let me explain. We only play e5 when the enemy queen is blocked from controlling the d-file. If the file was open, black could trade down the pieces and leave us in an equal position with good counterplay from both sides. Takes, knight h5, and now knight g5, forking on f7. This position is almost +5. I won't boggle your mind with more moves from various positions as there are millions of positions that we could cover here, but the key point is that you control the initiative and many of these seemingly safe and normal moves lead to completely winning positions for you. Let's now go back and look at bishop a5. It's considered the critical line and therefore it is what you'll see most of the time when you're facing good opponents. d4, e takes, and now we castle, just like the bishop c5 variation. Now if d takes c3, we play queen b3, attacking the f7 pawn. Queen e7 to stop this, and now knight takes c3, recapturing. takes, and if queen takes e4, rook e1 wins the queen because of the pin. Knight f6, bishop a3, attacking the queen. d6, but now e5, and black cannot take the pawn because the pawn is pinned to the queen, and once again, rook e1. Your opponent is in trouble as the position is plus 1.4 and knight e4 is the only move that doesn't make it an instant plus 3. Going back here, instead of d takes e3, knight f6 may occur. This is the most complicated position in the Evans Gambit. Bishop a3 to delay castling, d6, and now once again the idea of e5. D takes e5 is terrible as it prevents black from castling and enables us to play queen b3, starting up an attack. Queen d7 to protect f7, and now rook e1 and the position literally falls apart for black at a nice plus 3.4 evaluation. The best move for your opponent, instead of taking the pawn, is knight e4. We take the pawn now and follow up with queen d2, pinning the knight. Bishop f5, knight bd2, castles, and now we temporarily win a piece with knight takes d4, and now black plays rook e8, pinning the knight to the queen, and after bishop d5, the variation ends. This is the most complex variation in the entire video. Black will eventually win the piece back, but this variation is evaluated as completely equal. The reason I'm showing this is that this is one of the only variations that equalizes for black, and it requires the memorization of this exact entire variation, which is obviously very unlikely. Almost anything else that your opponent plays gives us a great advantage, and even in this position, there's a ton of fighting potential for white, which is why the Evans Gambit gets a #1 spot out of me with a rating of 9.4 out of 10. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, as only 6% of you are subscribed. Thank you.